The monitor beeped once, then flatlined into silence. "We're losing him!" a nurse shouted, and Amara Bryce felt her entire world collapse into that single sound. Her 5-year-old son, Micah, lay motionless on the hospital bed, his small chest barely rising, tubes running into arms too thin for what his body was fighting. The doctor's next words landed like a blade. "Mrs. Bryce, his organs are failing. He needs a bone marrow transplant within 72 hours. And the match has to come from a blood relative. Is there anyone? The father, a sibling, anyone we can test?" Amara's throat closed. There was a father. A man who didn't even know Micah existed. A man she had spent exactly one night with, one Christmas Eve 5 years ago, in a penthouse suite that smelled like cedar and expensive scotch, a night that had given her the only thing in her life she'd never once regretted, and the secret she'd guarded ever since. Telling him now meant reopening a door she'd nailed shut out of fear, pride, and the brutal math of what a poor single mother's word would be worth against a billionaire's name. But her son's heartbeat was fading on a screen in front of her, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Stay with this one till the end. A mother's love and a billionaire's forgotten promise are about to collide in a way that might just wreck you before it heals you. 12 hours earlier, in a glass tower 40 floors above the city, Julian Cross had been staring at a spreadsheet without seeing a single number on it. He was 32, self-made twice over after rebuilding his father's failing company from the ground up, and the tabloids loved to call him the coldest heart in venture capital. What they didn't know was that every December on the same night, Julian poured himself exactly 2 fingers of scotch and thought about a woman whose name he'd never learned, a woman with warm brown eyes and a laugh that had cracked something open in him for one single night before she vanished from the hotel before sunrise, leaving nothing behind but the ghost of a memory he'd never been able to shake. "You're doing the December thing again," said his assistant Reggie, leaning in the doorway with a knowing smirk. "The staring into nothing thing." "I don't do a December thing. You've done it 5 years running. At some point it's not a coincidence, boss. It's a pattern." Reggie tapped the door frame. "Whoever she was, she clearly did a number on you." Julian didn't answer, because Reggie wasn't wrong, and admitting that out loud felt like handing someone a key to a room he'd kept locked for half a decade. He turned back to the window instead, looking out over a city of 8 million people, wondering, not for the first time, whether the woman from that Christmas Eve was somewhere down there among them. Close enough to touch and impossible to find. What he didn't know was the actual truth. That 5 years earlier, on the very night that haunted him, a woman named Amara had walked into that hotel bar after the worst shift of her nursing career, exhausted, grieving a mother she'd just lost to cancer, and utterly unwilling to spend Christmas Eve alone in an empty apartment. She hadn't gone looking for a billionaire. She'd gone looking for one night where nobody needed anything from her. Julian, equally raw from a cancelled engagement and a father who treated affection like a line item, had wanted the exact same thing. Neither of them had exchanged last names on purpose. It was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to end at sunrise. Life, as it often does, had other plans. By morning, Amara was gone before Julian woke, leaving only a folded hotel notepad note that read, "Thank you for tonight. For once, I felt like myself." She never saw the message he'd left at the front desk asking her to call him. The front desk lost it in a shift change 3 days later, an ordinary clerical accident that would end up costing 2 people 5 years of each other, and one small boy 5 years without knowing his father's face. Amara had found out she was pregnant 6 weeks later, alone in a clinic waiting room, and made a decision in that moment that would define the next 5 years of her life. She would raise her son without asking a stranger to disrupt his, without becoming a headline, without gambling her child's stability on a man she'd known for exactly one night. She kept that decision even as money got tighter, even as double shifts turned into triple shifts, even as she watched other mothers at daycare pick up with husbands beside them and told herself, every single time, that she had made the right call. It had taken watching her son's heartbeat falter on a hospital monitor to finally make her question it. I need to see Mr. Cross. It's a medical emergency, she said to the receptionist on the 40th floor of Cross Industries, voice cracking 3 hours after she'd finally worked up the courage to leave the hospital and come find him. Mr. Cross doesn't take walk-ins, especially not. The receptionist's eyes flicked over Amara's worn coat, her exhaustion, the desperation written plainly across her face. Especially not without an appointment. That was when the elevator doors opened again, and Julian Cross walked out mid-conversation with two board members, laughing at something, effortlessly magnetic in the way certain men are simply built to be, and then he saw her, and every word died in his throat. You, he breathed, as if the air itself had been punched out of him. It's you. 5 years fell away in an instant. Amara opened her mouth to explain, to apologize, to somehow compress an entire life-altering truth into a single sentence in a marble lobby full of strangers. But before she could say a word, her phone rang. The hospital. She answered with tremblings, and the color drained completely from her face. He's crashing, the nurse said. You need to come back now. Amara looked up at Julian, really looked at him, at the face she'd spent 5 years trying to forget, and said the only thing that mattered. I have a son. He's 5 years old, and right now he is dying, and you are the only person on this earth who can save him. Something in this story is about to get a lot more complicated, and I promise you don't want to look away. If you're already invested, drop a comment telling me what you think Julian's first move is going to be. Julian didn't ask a single question in the elevator down, in the car, or in the 11 silent minutes it took his driver to break every speed limit getting to the hospital. He didn't ask because some part of him, the part that had spent 5 Decembers staring into a glass of scotch, already knew the answer before his mind caught up to his heart. He simply held Amara's hand the entire way, and when they burst through the hospital doors together, doctors already waiting, he said only one thing before they wheeled him in for testing. Whatever he needs, whatever it costs, take it from me. The results came back 4 hours later. A perfect match. Julian Cross was Micah's biological father. He should have felt betrayed. He should have felt lied to, manipulated, robbed of 5 years he could never get back. And for one raw, furious moment in a hospital corridor he did, his voice shaking as he demanded to know why she had let him live an entire half-decade without knowing his own son existed. Amara didn't flinch from the anger. She'd rehearsed this apology in her head 1,000 sleepless nights, because the last thing you said to me that Christmas morning, before I even had a chance to tell you I might be pregnant, was that you'd never let anything slow you down again. Not after your last relationship nearly cost you the company, she said, tears finally breaking free. I believed you. I thought I was protecting him from being an inconvenience to a man who'd already told me love was a liability. I was wrong to hide him. I was never wrong to love him enough to try to spare him that. Julian's anger cracked wide open into something raw, grief, guilt, and underneath all of it, a fierce and terrifying love for a boy he'd known about for exactly 4 hours. Then let me spend the rest of my life proving I'm not that man anymore, he said quietly. Starting tonight, in that operating room. The surgery took 9 hours. Amara and Julian sat side by side in a waiting room that neither of them left, not for coffee, not for sleep, not even when dawn broke pink and gold across the skyline. Somewhere around hour 3, Amara's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Denise, the only person outside that hospital who knew the full truth. You told him. Finally. How do you feel? Amara stared at the message for a long moment before typing back a single word, terrified, and then setting the phone face down, unable to explain the rest. Around hour 6, exhausted and stripped of every defense either of them had ever built, Julian reached over and laced his fingers through hers. For the record, he murmured, the faintest ghost of his old charm returning, you ruined me for every other Christmas Eve for 5 straight years. I hope you know that. Despite everything, Amara let out a wet, startled laugh. You ruined my ability to trust rich men in tailored suits for 5 straight years. So I'd say we're even. I'll have you know this suit cost more than most people's rent, Julian said, glancing down at his rumpled jacket. Feel free to be a little more impressed. I've seen scrub sets that were more impressive. Amara shot back, and for the first time in 9 agonizing hours, something like a real smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Careful, he said, leaning in slightly, voice dropping into something warmer, more familiar. Keep talking like that, and I might remember exactly why I couldn't stop thinking about you for 5 years. As maybe I'm counting on it, she admitted before she could stop herself. And the two of them sat there in stunned silence at what had just slipped out, something unspoken and undeniable settling quietly into the space between them, proof that whatever had started that Christmas Eve had never actually ended. It had just been waiting for the right moment to wake back up. We're only a third of the way into this one, and it's already asking a lot of your heart. Go ahead and subscribe now, because what happens to Amara and Julian next is going to test everything they just found. Micah survived the surgery. His small body, exhausted but stable, began its long climb back toward health, and for 2 weeks Julian didn't miss a single day at that hospital, learning how to be a father in real time, learning the particular music of his son's laugh, discovering that Micah loved dinosaurs and terrible knock-knock jokes and had inherited his mother's stubborn, brilliant eyes. He learned, too, that fatherhood came with its own kind of terror, the fear of getting it wrong, of a boy this small somehow seeing straight through him the way no boardroom ever could. "Why do you talk funny sometimes?" Micah asked him one afternoon, halfway through a plate of hospital jello. "Funny how? Like a news guy." Julian laughed harder than he had in years. "I'll work on that." "Okay," Micah said seriously, patting his hand like he was granting him a great favor. "You can practice with me, but billionaires don't get to fall in love quietly." And Julian Cross's sudden, very public devotion to a woman and child no one had ever heard of set off exactly the kind of storm his enemies had been waiting years for. Her name was Vivian Ashworth, Julian's on-again, off-again fiancée of convenience, a merger disguised as a relationship, arranged 2 years earlier by both families to consolidate cross-industries with Ashworth Capital. Vivian had never loved Julian, not really, but she had absolutely loved what marrying him would make her, and she was not about to let a hospital nurse's paycheck and a mistake from a hotel bar cost her a seat at the head of that empire. "You have a 5-year-old son with a woman you don't even know," Vivian hissed at Julian in his office, her composure cracking for the first time in 2 years. "Do you have any idea what this does to the merger? To the board's confidence in you? People don't hand billion-dollar decisions to men who let their personal lives become tabloid fodder. Micah isn't a scandal, Vivian. He's my son. He's a liability with a mother who kept him a secret for 5 years. How do you know she isn't just here for the money now that she knows exactly how much you're worth?" The accusation landed exactly where Vivian intended it to, planting a small poisonous seed of doubt that Julian hated himself for even briefly entertaining. That night, for the first time since the hospital, he didn't call Amara. He told himself he was just tired, buried in board documents, that it had nothing to do with Vivian's words. Amara, waiting by her phone in the small apartment she'd fought so hard to keep, felt the silence like a slow closing door, the old fear creeping back in that she would always eventually be the woman rich men were embarrassed to claim. Vivian, unwilling to leave anything to chance, made a second move that same week. She quietly hired a private investigator to dig through Amara's past, hoping to unearth debt, an old relationship, anything that could be twisted into a story the board and the press would happily believe. What the investigator found instead was a woman who had worked double shifts through 2 pregnancy scare complications, who had once sold her late mother's wedding ring to cover a month of daycare, and who had never, not once, taken $1 of public assistance she didn't desperately need. Vivian buried that report and started building a different one instead, one made almost entirely out of implication and doctored paperwork. 2 days after the silence began, Richard Cross, Julian's aging, image-obsessed father, showed up at Amara's apartment unannounced, holding a check with more zeros than she'd ever seen in her life. "I'm not here to be cruel," he said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own judgment. I'm here to be honest. My son has spent his whole career building something that took him 20 years and cost him almost everything. A scandal like this could unravel a merger worth $400 million, cost hundreds of employees their jobs, and hand-cross industries to competitors who would gut it for parts. I'm asking you, for Julian's sake, for your son's sake, take this, disappear quietly, and let my son's life go back to what it was. If you think a woman who spent 5 years raising her son through triple shifts is about to fold now, you clearly don't know her yet. And if this story already has you hooked, hitting that like button helps more people find it. Amara looked at the check for a long moment, long enough that Richard Cross allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, and then she folded it in half and handed it back to him. Mr. Cross, I raised your grandson alone for 5 years on a nursing assistant's salary, working double shifts so he'd never go without, and I did it without a single dollar of your family's money and without ever once complaining. I didn't come to that hospital that day for a check. I came because my son was dying, and his father was the only person who could save him. If you think a piece of paper is going to erase the fact that Julian and Micah share the same blood, the same stubborn eyes, and God help him, the same terrible sense of humor, then you don't know your son nearly as well as you think you do. She shut the door, gently but firmly, on Richard Cross's stunned silence. What Amara didn't know was that Julian, arriving early to surprise Micah with a new set of dinosaur toys, had been standing at the bottom of the stairwell the entire time and had heard every single word. That night, Julian showed up at Amara's apartment not as the CEO of Cross Industries, but simply as a man who had almost let fear and family pressure cost him the two people who had quietly become the center of his entire world. I let my father's voice in my head for one night, he admitted, standing in her doorway, more exposed than she'd ever seen him. And I let Vivian plant a doubt I should have shut down the second she said it. I'm sorry. You've never once asked me for anything, and I let the people around me convince me you might. That's on me, not you. Amara crossed her arms, guarding herself, but her voice softened. I spent 5 years protecting Micah from being anyone's inconvenience, Julian. I can't do that and also spend my life wondering if the next crisis is the one that finally makes you choose your family's approval over us. Then let me show you instead of telling you, he said, and pulled something from his coat pocket. Not a diamond, not yet, but a small hand-carved wooden dinosaur, the kind Micah had been begging for at every toy store they'd passed. I bought this for him 3 weeks ago and never gave it to him because I kept telling myself I needed to have everything figured out first. The company, my father, the merger, before I let myself really believe this was real. But nothing about loving you and that little boy needs figuring out. It's the only thing in my entire life that's ever made complete sense. Something in Amara finally, quietly, broke open, not from weakness, but from 5 years of carrying a secret alone, finally being allowed to set down its weight. She let him in that night, and for the first time since the hospital, the apartment filled with the sound of Micah's laughter, as father and son built a dinosaur battle scene across the living room floor, while Amara watched from the kitchen doorway, allowing herself, cautiously, to believe this might actually last. It didn't last long, undisturbed. 2 weeks later, Vivian's patience finally ran out, and she decided that if she couldn't win Julian back through pressure, she would win by burning the whole thing down instead. Now we're getting to the part of the story that changes everything. Comment below with a single word for how you're feeling right now, because it's about to get a lot more intense. The board meeting that was supposed to finalize the Ashworth Cross merger turned into something no one in that glass conference room expected. Vivian, sensing the tide had turned irreversibly against her, made her final, desperate move, leaking a doctored story to the press, claiming Amara had demanded millions in exchange for staying silent about Micah, complete with a forged version of the check Richard Cross had actually offered, timestamps altered to make it look like Amara herself had drafted the demand. The story broke that morning. Reporters swarmed the Cross Industries lobby. Amara's phone exploded with messages, half of them cruel, calling her exactly the gold digger Vivian had always wanted the world to see. Worse than the strangers online, a lawyer representing Vivian's family quietly filed paperwork questioning Amara's fitness as Micah's primary guardian, citing her financial history and suggesting that a child of Julian Cross deserved a more stable environment. Legal language for a threat that made Amara's blood run cold. For the first time since the hospital, Amara felt the old fear rise up whole and complete. The fear that no matter what she did, the world would always be faster to believe the worst of a poor black woman standing next to a billionaire than to believe the truth, and faster still to use the courts to prove it. She called Denise that morning in tears, packing a small bag out of pure panic, half convinced she needed to run before someone tried to take her son. "They can't just take him," Denise said firmly. "Not without cause, and you have given that boy nothing but cause to love you. Don't you dare let them scare you into running, Amara. You call Julian right now." Amara almost didn't. Some old, exhausted part of her wanted to handle this the way she'd handled everything else for 5 years. Alone. But she thought of the wooden dinosaur on Micah's nightstand, of the sound of his laughter in the living room, of a man who had shown up at her door not with excuse but with an apology, and she picked up the phone. Julian didn't hold a private meeting to handle it quietly. He walked directly into that press swarm an hour later, cameras flashing, Amara's hand held firmly in his. "There's a story going around this morning that isn't true, and I'm not going to let it stand for one more hour," he said, his voice carrying the same command it did in boardrooms. Except now there was nothing performed about it. Amara Bryce never asked me for a single dollar. She raised our son alone for 5 years on her own strength, her own sacrifice, and her own love, and the day he needed me, she walked into my office not for money, but because she is a better parent than I have ever been, and she wasn't willing to let her pride cost our son his life. The only person in this story who tried to buy silence with the check was my own father, and the only person who refused to take it was her. And as for the guardianship filing that landed on her lawyer's desk this morning, let me be very clear. Anyone who comes after this family through the courts is going to find out exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect it. Richard Cross, standing at the edge of the room, said nothing, but for the first time in years, something in his rigid expression shifted, quiet and unmistakable, the look of a man reassessing everything he thought he understood. That evening, without being asked, he called his own legal team and personally instructed them to submit a sworn statement confirming the real terms of the check he had offered Amra, cutting the legs out from under Vivian's fabricated story before it could gain any further traction. The forged check was traced back within 48 hours to Vivian's private investigator, and the scandal she'd engineered to destroy Amara collapsed spectacularly onto her own reputation instead. The guardianship filing was withdrawn within the week. Under threat of a defamation suit, Julian's legal team was more than ready to pursue. The merger board, rather than punishing Julian for the complication his family had feared, publicly praised his integrity, and cross-industry stock rose, not fell, in the following week. Proof that the world was hungrier for honesty than Richard Cross had ever given it credit for. If you've made it this far and you're rooting for these two as hard as I think you are, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the ending you've been waiting for is finally here. 6 months later, on Christmas Eve, in the same city where it had all begun 5 years earlier, Julian stood in the doorway of Amara's now much larger apartment, the one they shared together, watching Micah, now 6, race across the living room in dinosaur pajamas, shrieking with laughter as he was chased by the family's new golden retriever puppy. Richard Cross sat awkwardly but genuinely on the couch, learning slowly how to be a grandfather, having shown up unannounced 2 months earlier with an apology instead of a check. And Amara had let him in, not because she owed him grace, but because she'd learned that people, even ones who fail you badly, are sometimes capable of becoming something better if you leave the door open a crack. Denise sat beside him, unofficially appointed by Micah as the funny aunt, teasing Richard mercilessly about his inability to work the puppy's squeaky toy, and even Richard, stiff as ever, found himself laughing along. "You know," Julian said, wrapping his arms around Amara from behind as she watched their son and his father slowly, clumsily, build a real relationship. "5 years ago I spent one Christmas Eve with a stranger and spent every December after that wondering if I'd imagined how much I felt in one single night." "And?" Amara asked, leaning back into him, a smile pulling at her mouth. "And it turns out the most important thing I've ever built wasn't a company," he said quietly. "It was this, him, us. That's shockingly poetic for a man who once described our first meeting as a great acquisition," Amara teased. "I was nervous. And a little bit in love. Sue me. I might. I hear you're worth a lot of money these days." "There she is," Julian laughed, pulling her closer. "There's the woman who ruined every Christmas Eve I had for 5 years." He turned her gently to face him, and for the first time in the entire story, in front of no cameras, no board members, no father waiting to judge, Julian Cross got down on one knee and held up a small velvet box. "I don't want to spend one more Christmas Eve wondering what could have been," he said. "Marry me, Amara. Let me spend every year after this one proving that the night I found you wasn't the beginning of a scandal. It was the beginning of the best decision I've ever made." Amara, tears streaming freely down her face, laughing and crying all at once, said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, and across the room, Micah, sensing the moment even without understanding it, ran over and threw himself into both their arms, completing a family that had been years, secrets, and one impossible Christmas Eve in the making. What this story leaves us with is simple, but it's worth carrying with you. Love doesn't ask permission from the world's opinions, and the family you build out of courage and honesty will always be stronger than the one built on secrets, fear, or someone else's approval. Amara spent 5 years protecting her son alone because she believed her truth wasn't worth enough to be heard. But it was her honesty, in the end, that gave her son not just a father, but a whole family who chose them, fully and without conditions. And Julian, a man who had spent his life mistaking control for strength, finally learned that the bravest thing he ever did wasn't closing a merger. It was walking into that press swarm and choosing love over approval in front of everyone. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while writing it, tell me in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that real love is always worth the risk. And subscribe to Billion Whispers so you're here for the next one, because there is so much more where this came from.